All right, everybody, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show for our first experimental roundtable discussion on everything from philosophy and natural theology and Christianity. We'll see where this one goes. I am joined here by my good friends, John DeRosa and Eric Robinson. Gentlemen, how goes it?
It's going well despite the world about to end. I feel pretty good about things.
Well, as Catholics, we are obligated to be optimists, at least ultimately, right?
Yes. I like it. I like the optimism. It's always great to talk to you, Pat Flynn. Happy to be here.
So, John, I'm actually going to kick the kind of hosting duties over to you and let you lead a lot of this conversation. But before we do that, why don't we just start with some general introductions? Both of you have been on my podcast before, but let's assume that people have not heard our previous chats. Gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind just giving a quick overview of who you are, what you do, and then we can dive into our conversation. So actually, John, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Eric. Yep.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so my name is John DeRosa. I'm a high school math teacher in New Jersey, cradle Catholic, but I went through a lot of different decisions and thoughts about worldviews in life. And now I host the Classical Theism podcast, where we look into a lot of theistic apologetics and philosophy in general. And we have on great guests from people like Dr. Edward Fazer, to even Pat Flynn has been an expert on the show as well. And then hopefully I'll have Eric Robinson on in the future. But we talk all things apologetics with a focus on classical theism.
Beautiful. Eric, good sir. Please reintroduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Eric Robinson, and I host a podcast called Polycarp's Paradigm, because 5 years ago I became Catholic. I used to be Protestant, and a huge part of that conversion was the early church fathers like St. Polycarp, and I was actually confirmed under his name. And so my big passion is to reach out to my friends and family and really anyone who's Protestant or just not Catholic and draw them into full communion of the Catholic Church. And so explaining where we get these things, these ideas from the Catholic Church, where they are scripturally, is really where I come from. And it's been very enjoyable to do our, teaming up with Pat Flynn on our weekly sessions and getting to know him as well. And I'm excited to dive in with you as well today, John, on this topic of God and apologetics and everything that we're going to be talking about today.
Beautiful. Well, always a joy to talk with you too. And this is exciting because I know especially with you, John, being a full-time teacher, we don't always get to link up as often as possible. So I think we're trying to make the most of a somewhat grim situation here. So yeah, looking forward to this. And like I said, I'm going to kick it over to you, John, because
Sure.
You tend to be much more organized than I am, which I deeply appreciate. So what are we talking about today? What do you have
problem.
for us?
I'm excited because I think, we have different areas of interest and focus. There's like a division of labor in the Catholic Church, but we all, I think, share the general goal of wanting to make the faith reasonable to folks and to draw them into that deeper communion that they can really find happiness in the Catholic Church that we have found. And, it doesn't mean your life is going to be perfect and all sunshine and rainbows. We'll get into that. But, there is a deep abiding sense of believing in God, belonging to his church, that I think is just the most important thing in our lives. And it's cool because we got Eric. I know you mentioned you're really into, I've listened to your podcast, and when both of you chatting back and forth, tons of like good scripture stuff, good tradition, good things dealing with biblical apologetics and so forth. I've listened to a lot of Pat shows, heavy on philosophy, Thomistic philosophy, those talks with Gavin Kerr. My goodness, I need like a 3 cups of coffee to get through those. Those are intense.
We just had a chat last night, and it was so. That's me. So unfortunately, it's me being kind of selfish because Gavin he's such a brilliant guy. So I want to go into the weeds with him.
Love it.
But that's kind of, I don't know. I go back and forth because I know it will, for people who aren't familiar with metaphysics and philosophy, they might miss out on it. But I feel like I'd be missing so much if I didn't tap into his wealth of knowledge. So.
Oh, no, you got to do it. You got to tap into his wealth of wisdom, raise the bar. And then, folks, maybe I don't get everything out of it the first time I listen, but then you listen again, you read some of his books, and you get more out of it. I'm all about raising the bar with this kind of stuff. But yeah, today I thought it would be good to talk about arguments for God's existence, and also a little bit personally, how did we come to believe in God? Because, Eric kind of talked about his reversion. Pat, I've heard your story before, but with a focus on, believing in God, because I think we'll start there. Like, how did each of us come to believe in God? And then we'll go to some arguments for God's existence and things we find effective just when talking with people about the faith in general, because the cultural milieu that we're dealing with right now is definitely a lot different than like 15 years ago. And I remember the conversations I had in high school and in college, and a lot of them have definitely shifted in there being an increasing skepticism, scientism, things we'll talk about. But I thought that would kind of be our first question. Doesn't necessarily have to be Catholicism, but how did you come to believe in God? Did you always believe in God? And then what happened from there? I thought I'd just briefly share my story, and then I'll kick it over to you guys to answer that question as well. And then we'll get to the arguments. Does that sound good?
Yeah, please, John.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And mine's kind of boring because I pretty much always believed in God. Like I was baptized, and, I was taught to pray growing up. Recently, I remembered two funny moments in my, not funny, but like interesting moments in my life regarding belief. I do remember this. It was like first or second grade. I don't know when, but CCD class, someone actually asked the question that a lot of us were thinking, and that some people think is a good objection, but Phaser has shown it's not at all. But people asked, as first graders, who made God? Like we're learning about creation, and we're like, who made God? And I remember the teachers decided on a very odd answer to give to us in first grade. The answer we got was, well, God made himself.
Oh, no.
That was the answer we got in first grade CCD. But I just remember that moment in my life, like, oh, okay, like thinking about God, like, oh, is he real and so forth. But I still believed. And then the other moment was like curiosity over whether Santa Claus actually existed and whether it's actually real or not. And I remember trying to figure it out as like a younger kid. And eventually I just came to the realization that, he wasn't real. I kind of figured out what was going on, but I still didn't lose faith in God. I was like, okay, Santa Claus is not real, but I still prayed, and I felt God answered some of my prayers in a really important way.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably couldn't give you an argument if you asked me. If you asked like my 7-year-old self, my 12-year-old self, my 16-year-old self, I wouldn't have been able to give you arguments for God. I would just told you, well, I believe, I have faith, and it's a real part of my life. And then later on, like in college and afterwards, that's when I studied some arguments, and I flirted with a lot of different worldviews. So particularly after college, I felt a draw to like Reformed Protestant Christianity. And then at some point, I was kind of maybe considered myself an agnostic a little bit ish, but I still always believed, as far as I can tell. And then around like age 24, 25, I just felt God calling me to remain Catholic. And then I just built my home in the Catholic Church. But over time, I went from like not having any arguments to studying more arguments. But I always believed in God. But I'm curious, why don't we'll kick it over to Eric next, because I don't know your answer at all. And then Pat, I'm sure viewers have heard your story, but we still want to hear it again.
Well, for me, it's very similar to you. It's going to be more boring than Pat's answer, of course. But I pretty much always believed in God as well. In fact, I don't remember not believing in God. And actually, it's interesting. On my podcast, I recently interviewed back in January one of my friends who went from being Christian to being agnostic. And when he first became a friend of mine, he asked me, "Hey, Eric, have you ever like doubted God's existence?" And I was like, "No, actually, like I haven't." And in fact, something happened to me in college that was like pretty intense spiritual warfare that I won't get into here. But basically, it was like at this point now, after that happened, like I just can't. Like it's like impossible for me to doubt God's existence in light of that encounter. And so for me, it's more about I've always really believed in God, and really the person of Jesus having that focal point of on Christ himself, and always believing that he was God in the flesh, And so I've really never struggled with that. But I do encounter with my friend who became agnostic and some other people of like arguments against God's existence, which has had me, Peter tells us we always have to be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks us for a reason for the hope that is in us.
Right.
And I'm continually learning those things. But sometimes it is hard for me to even relate to people that really struggle with God's existence, because I just haven't struggled with that. So we all come from different backgrounds and different stories, but that's just where I'm at.
Right. So I have a lot that I actually admire about both of your accounts. Sometimes I talk to people who are cradle Catholics and have always had a very strong belief in God. And they say, "Oh, I don't have as cool of a story as you, as somebody who was an atheist for a while." And I don't see my story as cool at all. I think it's kind of stupid, actually. to be perfectly frank. And I don't think there's anything particularly noble about it. I fell away from faith for what ultimately were some pretty lame reasons. I don't think they were entirely my fault, because I just, when I was younger and you start getting pressed with just, pretty basic skeptical objections, and you just don't have, or you didn't have a proper catechesis. People didn't seem to have, and part of it was me just being shy too. I'm sure I probably could have found good answers, but I felt uncomfortable asking people, even my own parents, for example, of well, how do you reconcile God with, modern cosmology and the Big Bang Theory and things like that, and what we read in Genesis. And these were the things that sort of caused me initially to stumble. I remember specifically back in the 6th grade, and it's kind of weird because we're living in an eerie time that reminds me of that. This time reminds me of back then, because that's when 9/11 happened. And it seems very unreal what's going on with our country and the world right now with this pandemic. And there's some similar feelings. That's neither here nor there. What happened in the 6th grade is that was when my science teacher introduced, at least the general sketches of Big Bang cosmology. And I remember just feeling this sinking feeling of oh wow, that's not really what I remember learning in Sunday school, right? Of the story of Adam and Eve and creation. And we can all circle back to that if we want to later, but those were my initial seeds of doubt. And then that skepticism grew over the years, especially as I got deeper into certain writers. I loved Mark Twain. Mark Twain passed me off to H.L. Mencken, who was a vicious old atheist and skeptic. He passed me off to Friedrich Nietzsche and all the old atheists and existentialists. And the short story is, I'll condense it here, is that worldview ultimately collapsed. I just realized this cannot possibly be true. Naturalism, it just can't be true, right? It's explanatory power. From my view, it has none, right? It just cannot explain the things that need to be explained. And, that eventually caused me to reconsider the theistic worldview, to get very interested in natural theology, arguments for God. I eventually came to a belief in God, which then made me want to consider if any religion was true, see if there were any good arguments there. And eventually I was brought through a very windy way into the Catholic faith. But I guess the point I want to make is I feel like I admire and I appreciate both of your stories. Even Gavin Kerr, he brought this point up too. He's been a cradle Catholic. I feel like I have skeptical scarring, if that makes sense, right? Because you're a skeptic for so long, it wounds you in a way that there's always this kind of unnecessary skeptical attitude that I take. It's actually a big drain on me that I wish wasn't there, because I think I can see clearly through that, and I shouldn't have these attitudes anymore, but it's still there. And I think that's so I can relate and I can empathize for people who've ever struggled with doubts or unbelief. So I think that's useful, and there's God's providence in that, because I can really communicate to people who've been there, because I've been there. But at the same time, there's this I don't even know how to explain it aside from this kind of skeptical scarring, where I just generally have this disposition of unwarranted skepticism, even though I'm fully a Catholic at this point. It's just something that on an emotional, personal level, I wish would go away, but it yet lingers, if that makes sense.
No, I think it's your story, Pat, is extremely important, and it's cool that we each kind of have a different story. And I mean, imagine we were interviewing thousands of different Catholics. I'm sure they all have their own unique story, but what you have, Pat, is extremely powerful that Eric and I don't have, in that you can actually say that you fell away from the faith, you were an atheist for a time, and that it's possible to come back and to find answers. And that's going to be really important, I think, when you talk with people who are agnostics, who are atheists, who are our young people, because if we come across as just I've always believed in God, how could you not? Everyone does, and blah, blah, blah. They don't like that attitude, especially you're talking to a 13-year-old, 14-year-old in confirmation class. It's very important to have people that they can relate to, that actually investigated these things, and upon that investigation grew into a deeper relationship with God and a deeper understanding of the faith. If we don't have that, it's going to be really tough. And we're going to be talking about some arguments that will be most important when presenting or discussing God's existence. But before that, I just want to know, what are some who are you having these conversations with when you've had them? And what's been the nature of the questions and the conversations about God's existence? I know my own experience. I did a 9th grade confirmation retreat. Pat, I think you're involved with a lot of young folks in your class and some small groups. Eric, you might be involved in your church and so forth. Oh, and Pat, you got to talk about St. Paul street evangelization too, because I'm sure they get all kinds of objections. But why don't we just say a few minutes on what are the conversations like when we're talking about God's existence? Where are people? Because I think they're in a different place than they were maybe like 10 or 15 years ago. Pat, why don't we start with you for that?
Right. So I have conversations with people all over the place, obviously online, offline. But with the kids specifically, it's interesting. I find that the catechesis at the parish I'm at is okay. The kids, I haven't run into too many skeptical kids yet, which is like, it's kind of funny because like I almost kind of wanted to, but at the same time, I'm glad I haven't. Right? That's good that they're not. Right? So because I'm like in the crowd here, and let's share my experience with them. But I actually haven't had that experience. A lot of them are. They feel confident in what they believe, but there's not a lot of depth to their beliefs. I feel that there's more so a lack of catechesis, a lack of appreciation. So when I have the conversations with the teenagers, I actually try to present skeptical objections. I actually try to present the problems and get them thinking, and then I let them think about it. And then if they get stuck, I try to offer them a way out. So I try to facilitate what I think is a healthy skepticism and a healthy level of thinking. But I have to say, completely honestly, I have not actually encountered, and this is a big, it's 150 kids at my parish in their confirmation. I only am responsible for about 15 of them at the time. But there is definitely, within this subset of the population I'm working with, is very small. There's not as much skepticism I've found there as there is out on the internet, say, and the people I deal with in everyday conversation, either online, through email, or through other published work. So that's a general sketch, but happy to discuss more if we want.
Well, I'm going to kick it over to Eric in a second, but I just want to say, Pat, just because you haven't witnessed it doesn't mean it's not there. A lot of times, what I find with the teenagers is they're not going to open up about their skepticism. Mm-hmm. They might be having some objections in their head and like debating it, like, is this stuff really real? Is this, a bunch of garbage? But they might not actually say it. So it's so powerful to raise those objections, because even if they like don't want to say them, so imagine they're being taught CCD by, some, 50 or 60-year-old Catholic lady who's so devout and is just like teaching the Adam and Eve story. They're going to feel like, oh, I don't want to burst her bubble and like tell her that science has disproved this stuff, but they might be thinking it. So the fact that you bring that stuff up is very important for the conversation they're having in their head. Would you agree with that?
No, 100%. And I think about how I would have felt when I was that age, and I would have been exactly what you said. I would have been the one sitting there, not sure if I believed it. I wasn't a full atheist in the 6th grade. It was a process, like a lot of these things are, but I would have been doubting, and I would have been too shy to bring it up. So I'm trying to kind of fish some of the skepticism out of them. Yeah. None of them have really have taken hold of that yet, have really exposed themselves as being deeply in doubt. But to your point, that's exactly what I'm hoping to do is, okay, they're probably thinking some of this stuff anyways. So let me just see if I can address as much of it as I can, and at least show them that, hey, there are good answers to these things. Even if this isn't the specific question that you have, just showing that good answers exist can often inspire a lot of hope and confidence.
Absolutely. Eric, what's it like over in, I think you're in Colorado now. What's it like there as far as conversations or things online?
Well, I just moved here last week, John, and the coronavirus is making me solitary. I don't really have much exposure to people these days in my new living situation. But in Texas, where I came from, and, on the internet and stuff and just friends, I kind of identify there's really 2 types, maybe 3 types of people that I encounter when it comes to like an atheism or something like that. It's really, number one is like atheists slash agnostics. And I really think agnosticism is probably the preeminent one. When I was talking with my friend on that podcast episode, his objections, like I was pretty surprised actually. One of his main objections to God's existence was, and we can get into this later, but was animal suffering. Not even human suffering, but animal suffering, because they lack the free will. So why should they be inflicted with suffering? Doesn't that, blah, 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 blah. The other that I encounter on a very personal level, because it's, someone very close to me, is New Age. And being like, I'm spiritual, but not religious, and almost like a pantheistic worldview that's like, hey, the universe is God, and we just need to connect with the universe. And so that's a different form of not atheism, obviously, it's pantheism, but it's just a different non-Catholic skepticism, I guess, I encounter. And into that really is this relativism, this culture of relativism that's like, hey, yeah, you're Catholic, like you can believe that, that's cool. I especially experienced this actually with my Protestant friends, and I call it Christian relativism. Is like, hey, whatever denomination suits you is good. And so there's that, and then I think that that's in our culture in general, where a lot of people are just like, yeah, you can believe in God if you want, I don't have to, and it's fine. And so it's almost like a practical atheism or agnosticism. It's like we're going to live our lives as if God didn't exist, even though we really don't know, or whatever might be the case. But it's like you're already assuming your belief to be true by saying that, you know? So those are the things that I encounter that are kind of hard to work through sometimes.
No, and I think it's important that there's a variety of conversations that we're all having. And listen, people are going to be drawn to different aspects and different types of conversations. Like maybe not all of us are, cut out to deal with like those new age objections or to get really deep into that. That is interesting. But I will say in New Jersey, I don't sense a ton of that. People are kind of more just like indifferent about God and going about their busy lives. And perhaps they're just like a default agnostic in a sense where they're just like, well, I've never seen any evidence, so I don't know what to think. But whereas Pat's talking about, he's dealing with a whole nother animal and he does a lot of internet work. So I think we're all called to different places. But what I wanted to ask, and feel free to take this a different direction if you want, but so say we're presented with an agnostic or an atheist. Say they could be a teenager, they could be our friend that's, our same age, they could be older and so forth. At some point, they're going to make a demand. They're going to be like, show me the evidence. You're saying that God exists. You're saying you believe in God. Why should I think that's any different than, Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy? Like, what do we actually present? And that's going to kind of lead us into some different ideas here. What do you present to those folks? What have you found useful? And if you wanted to add another point before that, Pat, it sounded like you did.
Yeah, I do. About good old Santa Claus there. Because you brought up an interesting thing, and actually we got some initial pushback from the grandparents on this, but we don't teach our kids Santa Claus at all, right? For many reasons. One is I don't think you should lie to your kids. And two is you want your kids' trust. And it's interesting because you see this objection so often. It's one of those stupid internet objections of people like, well, I don't believe in Santa Claus, so why should I believe in God? And the simple answer there is because we have good reasons to believe in God and good reasons not to believe in Santa Claus, right? If Santa Claus existed, we would expect certain things to be the case. We can investigate these things, and they are not the case. I never see a fat guy coming down my chimney. There's no workshop in the North Pole, so far as we can tell. So there, the absence of evidence does count as evidence of absence. Whereas if God exists, and this is to your second point, is if I think one of the best ways just to get the conversation started is just list the types of things that we might expect or that make sense given God's existence. One is that any contingent thing exists. Two is that the universe began to exist. Three is that the universe appears finely tuned for the emergence of intelligent interactive life. Another one would be our perception of objective moral values and duties and obligations. Another would be the irreducibility of consciousness to physical processes alone. Another would be just general religious experiences, mystical experiences, even more importantly, I think near-death experiences, the uncanny applicability of mathematics to the physical universe. The fact that our universe is even stable, orderly, and intelligible at all seems fantastically improbable if there weren't an ordering mind behind it. And of course, we as Catholics would argue that the resurrection, right, that of how people came to this sudden and profound belief and that transformed the world of this as a historical event and the historical facts surrounding the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, I do not think can be plausibly explained apart from God's existence. So I think before, and like, of course, we can go into the weeds of any one of those, but just taking that truckload of what I think is evidence and just plopping it down on the scale in favor of theism, I think itself can be very persuasive, just so people can see, oh, I never thought of it like that, or maybe I wasn't looking in the right places. And then you can contrast that with Santa Claus. Like if Santa Claus existed, I don't find any of the evidence that I should expect. But if God exists, it seems like the evidence is overwhelming what I might expect. Or even if I couldn't predict it, it at least makes sense given a theistic worldview, is how I might start the conversation.
I think that's a great initial answer. I think everybody's got to have a list. That was pretty impressive, Pat.
Yeah,
I don't have that. a list of 7 or 8 things memorized that you could point to? Because if someone says, like, show me the evidence, and you're like, well, how did we get here? Like, if that's all you have, that's not going to fly, especially with like if that's all you got, like, it's not going to move someone. But if you have a list, maybe it's not 7, I'm just trying to count them, 7 or 8 things that Pat Flynn just listed, but maybe it's even 2 things that you like are your go-to arguments or your go-to piece of evidence, or even 3 things. And then you study those and you get them on the table. Imagine every adult Catholic, when asked for some evidence that God exists, could at least point to like 2 or 3 things. And that, I think, would go a long way in the cultural conversation of getting rid of the Santa Claus objection and that there's no evidence, to talking about, well, actually, people have presented evidence. Pat Flynn just gave you a bunch. Let's examine it. What do you think about it? Eric, do you jive with any of those things on Pat's list? What would you point to if any of those things, or maybe some additional items on your own? What do you think is helpful?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I got to interview Pat on his story one time and got to hear all more details about each of those. And so I was pretty blown away, especially the consciousness one. I think that's a powerful one. For me, I do come back to like a designer argument. Like, okay, when you pass like a house on your street, you're not like assuming that it just miraculously appeared, and over time it just like came to be. There, like, you automatically assume like, okay, there's an architect, there's something intelligent that went into this thing. And what's way more complex than that is like our eyeballs, for instance, or any human person, or even like the complexity of an insect. And so you're like, you look at these designs and they're ordered, and obviously we as Catholics, we can believe in evolution, but there has to be some sort of intelligent designer behind that explains why it is the case that they're orderly and designed and all of those things. So I think that's something I do come back to. Another thing is the transcendentals. Like, I really haven't found a good answer. Maybe there is, and I would love to hear what y'all think. But like, I often ask like atheists or agnostics, well, hey, do you believe in like love? Like, what is love, or hope, or like, yeah, I know it's like a simple thing, but it's like, I mean, how do you explain like the fact that Saint Maximilian Kolbe willingly starved in Auschwitz on behalf of someone else, and he had no material benefit to do that? Like, he literally died for that person. And there's no chemical reaction happening in his brain that was like in a dopamine spike for that. It was just like pure suffering. He embraced it. So how do you explain that to me? Because the fundamental, like the core Christian belief is that God is love. Okay, so if you admit that love exists, then okay, we're on our way to something that transcends the material. That's at least what I think about that.
A lot of that, and I think these are good things. I think a lot of these are good clues because they hit people right in the gut, right? I was talking with a friend many years ago as I was still working my way into the Catholic faith, and he was a pretty hardened atheist, and he just had a kid, and he made some joke about everything just being some chemical interaction in the brain and nothing more than that. And I just said to him, like, is that really all you think that your love for your daughter is? And I didn't even advance any more of an argument after that, but that made him take a serious step back. And we haven't talked in a while since, but I saw that's suggesting that, like, reducing, because that doesn't really seem like love at all, right? Like, right. It seems like something fundamental is missing here. So I think, even like just making suggestions, like, we don't always have to have like a definitive airtight deductive argument, but just making suggestions that have certain consequences that people feel very uncomfortable accepting. Like, my love for my kids is just some type of determined chemical program, and it's nothing more authentic than it. Nobody wants to accept that, because intuitively we all know that it's more than that. It's not fundamentally reducible to that. And I think that that's very helpful. Of course, the hardened skeptic will be like, well, it's just an evolutionary spandrel. Anything we can't explain is just a spandrel, an offshoot of the evolution. It's like, give me a break, right? How convenient. We'll just classify everything under a spandrel.
I'm sorry, what is this word? A spandrel?
A spandrel. It's kind of like it's like an offshoot. Something functional developed, but something also went wrong, and there's an offshoot. It's like it's like one of those hand-waving, all-encompassing things to try and explain like uber altruistic behavior, like Eric's hinting at, right? That would have, you really can't think of any type of survival or fitness benefit to this type of behavior. So people just kind of wave at it and say, that must be a spandrel, right?
You would know the word spandrel. Eric, whenever I talk to Pat Flynn and I ask him like what he's reading like the biggest slog through books that like I've ever heard of, that like I would just fall asleep 10 times before I could get through it. But it's an incredible word, spandrel. But no, I like this idea of pointing to the transcendentals. Kind of, and Michael Gormley is like a Catholic evangelist. You might know him from Catching Foxes or Ascension Press. He's got a podcast, Every Knee Shall Bow. And he points out what he tries to do at his confirmation retreats is just kind of like crack into the materialism. If folks are really kind of bummed out by the idea that there's just rock bottom physical reality and particles, and that's all there is, try to crack into that in some way or other. And one way, right, is pointing out the transcendentals. He tries to do it through ethics and like a moral argument. But I do want to go back because, Eric, you started off with design. That was intriguing. I will say, though, you say that to any skeptic, what you said before, and they're just going to say, oh, you know, Mr. Robinson, maybe that was a good argument 300 years ago. But Darwin came along. And now everything can just be explained by evolution. So I think we got to go, can there still be a design argument that works on any level, given the fact, if as Catholics, because you said we're allowed to believe in evolution, how might we, and this can go, you know, Pat, you could talk about this, Eric, you could talk about this, how might we make a persuasive, quote unquote, design argument given evolution, or perhaps even granting it? What do you say to that?
Right. Eric, do you want to go? Or you want me to go here?
I'll just go real quick and then dish it off to you. So basically, I loved what you were saying, Pat, the other day about, you know, the more we learn from science, actually, the more I think persuasive it is, the design argument, because we're learning about the fine tuning of the universe. Like if one of 30 things is off a little, we don't exist. And so the more we actually do learn from science about the natural world, the more we see how complex and how almost impossible it is that this just happened by chance. That's not to say that it can't be an evolutionary process. It just means that there has to be something else that's guiding this process. And we're seeing it through science that it's so complicated. What did they really know about a cell in Darwin's day? And what do we know now? We know how complex a cell is.
Right.
I did a project in 9th grade about the irreducible complexity of the bacterial flagellum, which is basically we can't explain why this bacteria has a tail, because it needs all 22 parts to form it at once. It can't just happen just part by part. And so that was an interesting thing, just looking at the design of something so simple as a bacterial flagellum. And so,
just to chime in, the reason that that's important to understand, right? And this is part of Behe's work, is that it's until all the parts are there and coordinated and working together, it is functionally useless, right? It doesn't offer any evolutionary benefit. So there's, if not a logical contradiction, I don't think there's a logical contradiction, but there's a severe tension between these molecular machines and the typical neo-Darwinian proposal of how evolution occurs. Is just to highlight the point there, right?
I got to cut in for a second because I am floored right now as to what we are getting into. This is incredible because Eric, Pat and I were talking the other day, and we're talking about intelligent design and such, because there's a lot of Catholics that are against this sort of thing. And Pat, I'm going to give you a chance in a second too. We've kind of been running two arguments together and conflating them a little bit, the fine tuning versus the intelligent design. So I'm going to let you disentangle those for the listeners. And then maybe we'll talk about, because Eric, I was actually expecting you as a Catholic convert to maybe be down on those ID arguments. And I thought we might have a good old-fashioned disagreement among the three of us. But it sounds like all three of us are perhaps even open to that sort of an argument. So, Pat, I'm going to give you a chance to explain what are these kind of two separate design arguments we've been running together, and which one should maybe all Catholics accept, which one are Catholics a little bit skeptical about, and talk a bit about that.
I think everybody should accept a version of Aquinas' fifth way as somebody like Dr. Fazer would present it. I think that is the strongest design argument. It is a teleological argument that can get you deductively to an uncaused, necessary, intelligent reality. Now, that the unfortunate side there is it's much more technical and it's much more abstract and difficult to understand. So it's not as convenient to present in everyday conversation, but we can see that there are bound up in the essences of some things. So you got to have to explain what essentialism is. an inherent pointing or directedness to an effect or a range of effects, right? Acorns are pointed to an oak tree. So in some sense, the oak tree is the cause or the final cause of the acorn. But how can that be the case if the oak tree doesn't exist before the acorn? Well, it exists as a sort of template in the mind of the designer, right? It's the only way you can make sense of the most fundamental form of teleology. I think that is the strongest design argument. But I also think, again,
then there's going to be three levels then. So if you go fifth way, that's like perhaps the strongest, the metaphysical demonstration, and then it would be something, and then the third thing. Go ahead.
Right. So yeah, the metaphysical demonstrations I am very confident about. I think those are the most robust, but like I said, you have to roll up your sleeves and do the metaphysics, which takes work, and that's not always going to be easy to present in everyday conversation. The benefit of some of these other ways is I think they're easier to grasp and more intuitive for most people most of the time. So the second level would be the fine-tuning argument, which is effective because you can do an end run around evolution. You can just skip the whole evolution debate because, look, for evolution to even occur, it depends on a very special, an extremely special kind of universe. And that's where the fine-tuning argument comes in. It says, hey, look, right at the very beginning, right at the start of physical reality, we have this precise tuning of these constants and quantities that, as Eric suggested, if they were off by even a hair's breadth, not only would there not be life, in many cases we wouldn't even have chemistry, or the universe would have just collapsed right back in on itself. And how do we explain this, right? And people you can either make a reasonable or responsible inference, or you can try and push it a little more aggressively and say it's either chance, necessity, or design. Chance itself always depends on the convergence of previously existing non-chance events. Well, if this is right at the beginning of physical reality, chance is out. No physicist, so far as I know, really thinks that any of these things are necessary. And a lot of these constants and quantities are independent of each other as well. You could tweak one and it really wouldn't make a difference for you. That's not the truth for all of them, but some of them are really just independent. They're just kind of put in, if you will. And so the best, I think, most reasonable and responsible inference from this is that there is an intelligent designer that specifically set things up for a purpose so that evolution could occur, for example. And when you realize this, evolution then, I think, points largely in favor of theism, because evolution, we just take it for granted, right? Evolution just can't occur by itself, right? It depends on this very special kind of universe. And then people want to push it even further, and this would be where intelligent design comes in. I would say sympathetic and open, but this has not been a heavy area of research for me. And the reason is because it just doesn't make a difference to me at this point, honestly. Right. Like I'm already sold. I don't see what other benefits going to come from spending hours and hours of specialization in this. But I will say I've read all the prominent books. I've read what I have searched out to see what I think the best objections and rebuttals are. And for me, it seems like the weight of the evidence is with people like Dr. Behe. When it comes, I don't think his objections have been significantly or substantially countered when it comes to this.
Can you say more, though? How does it differ from the fine-tuning argument, what Behe's doing?
So what he wants to say is that even when you look at certain he focuses on molecular machines like the bacterial flagellum, is that given what the neo-Darwinian paradigm says, and we have to actually get clear about evolution. Evolution is an accordion term that can mean more or less depending on who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. And Behe will say, hey, look, I think there is really strong evidence for evolution, specifically the genetic evidence. And I agree. I think the strongest evidence for evolution is the genetic evidence. But what Behe is challenging in some of these, and you have to be very clear, he's not saying that evolution isn't true. He's saying there's a problem specifically with the mechanism that is proposed to drive evolution, which is selection and mutation, which is that we can imagine that there can be great creative power through small successive steps, right? And he gives examples which are becoming more abundant as we increase in our understanding of the biological and molecular world of these sort of irreducibly complex systems that, like Eric said, is like these things are only useful when there's massive coordination of all these different parts. So how these things would ever be assembled or selected for, since they have no functional utility or benefit until, say, stage 27 or 28, which would take an enormous amount of time to get to, there's like I said, a very strong, it's not a contradiction, but a very strong tension. And the challenge is we need more than this, right? This mechanism isn't sufficient. Given the theory versus given the evidence we do have, there's a problem here. And that's specifically what they're challenging. But of course, if you have a designer, and they don't even really say that the designer is God, they're just saying like, look, if you have a designer that can make these, that can coordinate things, the purposeful arrangement of parts, problem solved. And whenever we look around the world and we see the purposeful arrangement of parts, right? If Alvin Plantinga gives the example, if we were like to go up to the moon and we found a radio there, right? Our immediate, like, and it's a weird looking radio, but it's purposeful, it's doing stuff, it's coordinated. Our first intuition would not be natural selection. Our first intuition would be, aliens exist, right? And like everybody would be reasonable to assume that, right?
Or if it was the moon, then maybe we left something there when we went.
Or maybe Neil Armstrong dropped his transmitter or something like that, right? And there's sometimes you got to take like 10 steps back and realize, oh wow, yeah, actually maybe things are a little simpler, than we often give them credit for at times. But that's how I would break down the levels, and I would say I am in no way hardcore committed to ID itself. I'm open to the evidence on either side, because even if you could show that the Darwinian, whatever the modern Darwinian proposal is itself capable of this great, incredible constructive power, it would still do nothing to undermine the other, I think, more fundamental design arguments.
And real quick clarification, Pat, he believes in microevolution, but does he reject macroevolution, like the leaps between species then?
So Behe's latest book, Darwin Devolves, what he wants to do is he wants to even push it further. He says, yeah, evolution and natural selection can account for small changes, right? Like the finch beaks and stuff like that.
Right.
But the way evolution
by the way, if you ask anybody about this discussion, macro, microevolution, and so forth, I love how as Catholics, we're if we want to, we could just grant all this. We don't have to get
exactly. Yeah.
If you do ask for examples, it's so interesting to me. You always get the same ones. It's always finch beaks, E. coli bacteria, peppered moths, or dog breeds. It's literally those four that just get cycled again and again. But anyway, sorry, Pat, you're going to go ahead.
And Behe addresses all of these, which is really important. And he shows actually, no, this is in support of my argument, because the way evolution really seems to work based on the best evidence we do have is it at least selection and mutation is it works in the same way that like kicking the doors off a car will work, right? It can give you a fitness benefit, but it's a self-limiting fitness benefit, right? If I'm driving and I'm trying to get away from somebody, I might be able to kick the doors off and gain some more speed, but that's inherently limiting. That's obtaining a fitness benefit through a really destructive means. So it has a sort of fitness conferring ability, but it doesn't have, he wants to say, it doesn't have a creative, not an especially creative constructive ability. It just cannot count for the creation of really novel complex systems.
So yeah, you can't go from, you basically would go simpler. You wouldn't go more complex.
Right. And so it's kind of fitness through forms of degradation. And I would highly recommend his new book, Darwin Devolves. And I would recommend going to his site because he has some very detailed scholarly engagement with serious people on the other side and going back and forth. So I would just say, just look into it and read it and see where the evidence falls to you. But as Catholics, again, as believers in God, it could go either way and it doesn't matter, which is why I haven't invested too much time into this, because but to John's point, I also see, and this goes back to what we were talking about before earlier, Eric, is I think people often make way too many concessions that are unnecessary at the same time and for not good reasons. And I see many Catholics, even many Catholic scientists that I've talked to, and I actually had a debate on my podcast between Dr. Behe and Dr. Trasankos, and Dr. Trasankos is a Catholic scientist, wonderful woman, incredibly smart, and she's skeptical of ID, but I don't think she had very many good objections or arguments. I think that Behe was able to successfully address her hesitation and really present his account. So I see a lot of hand waving, but I don't see a lot of substantial engagement from people, even Catholics who tend to be skeptical of this. Now, maybe I'm completely missing something, but that's my current assessment.
Let me play the devil's advocate a bit because, first of all, you just got to laugh, Eric, when you hear Pat Flynn say, I haven't invested much time into this. And he's like listing out all the books that he's read on this
stuff. Like, I've invested nothing,
Ladies and gentlemen, that is Pat Flynn for you. I love it. Absolutely love it. But anyway, the idea I want to play devil's advocate because there are some Catholics that would be absolutely horrified to listen to the last 15 minutes of our conversation because they have already kind of made all those concessions to evolution. So let's just get the idea on the table. The reason why Dr. Edward Fazer, and I'm even reading another book, Never Doubt Thomas by Dr. Frank Beckwith, they point out they don't like intelligent design. And this is not all of their objections, because they say that the intelligent design advocates zero in on this way of defeating naturalism to show that at the fundamental level, you got to find evidence of God's footprints somewhere, and they find it at this molecular level. Therefore, God exists. And what Beckwith and Fazer and others point out is, no. This gets causality wrong, because as Catholics, as classical theists, we believe in both, primary causality and secondary causality, that God can create the world and that God can be acting through secondary causes, which of their own steam, so it seems, conjoined with divine action always, they can bring about more and more effects according to his providential plan. And when the intelligent design advocates make it sound like unless you find God's footprints inside the cell or inside the bacterial flagellum, you're giving too much away. And I think this was Trasankos's criticism of Behe. She kept saying, like, I want to go bigger. I want to say, like, God is responsible for the whole show, and perhaps we can lead into, finish off maybe talking about a cosmological argument. But I think that's one of their primary concerns, that people are going to be too focused on putting the footprints in somewhere.
Yeah, so I would say a couple things to that, and I hate to disagree with people like Fazer and Beckwith, because I admire them so much, but I think that there's a lot of just talking past each other on this point. Honestly, I agree as a Thomist that the most robust, you're not going to get from the arguments of intelligent design to classical theism. You're not. There's no way you're getting from that to divine simplicity. There's just, you can't do it. So I think if you want the most robust conception of God, you do need to roll up your sleeves and do the deeper metaphysics, and that will give you a more proper and more thorough understanding of God. Completely agree, 100%. And that will give you a firm confidence in God's existence entirely apart from any of these other arguments, which I think is also valuable. At the same time, I can tell you from talking with Dr. Behe that he agrees with that. He says, I think the best arguments for God are the philosophical ones, right? So he's not like saying that this is a better way of arguing for God. All he says is like, look, here's what is being proposed in the scientific community. I'm saying the best evidence we have counts against that proposal. So I just want to know if this proposal itself is true. And that seems like a perfectly valid thing to want, right? We just want truth. Like, we have proposal, we have counter evidence. It doesn't seem to fit the hypothesis here. And it seems like no matter what, any honest person should say, okay, this is worth considering wholly independent of all these other arguments. And that's what I see going on. It's just a lot of talking past each other on this conversation, and really people just missing each other's points almost entirely. So I don't know.
That's big. And I just want to say, I love that as Catholics, we're free, and Dr. Craig makes this point too, Christians more broadly, we can follow the evidence where it leads. And if it leads us to a full-blown theory of evolution with perhaps some additional mechanisms that haven't yet been studied and so forth, or if it leads us with, evolution generally, but you need some other designing along the way, or some information added here and there, or front-loaded, or whatever term he wants to use, wherever it leads, so be it. We will accept it. But no, I think that's a key point you made, Pat, that he doesn't doubt that the philosophical arguments are more robust. So his stuff, at the very least, it deserves a fair hearing. So I'm glad
and that's it. It's very specific. He's just challenging one specific aspect of evolutionary theory, and that's it. And people have just heaped all kinds of terrible, vicious attacks on him. They label him like a fundamentalist and a creationist and all. And he's just not that. He's not that at all. He's a molecular biologist. He's an incredibly smart man. He's a highly trained specialist. And he's a really good guy. Like, I've really chatted with this guy. He doesn't deserve these insults at all. And maybe he's wrong, but it seems to me that he's at least sincere, right? And it seems to me that his arguments deserve attention, like you said, John. Mm-hmm.
Did you want to add something to that, Eric? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I used to be more, growing up as a Protestant, and not all Protestants are like this, but I grew up more really hammering these intelligent design arguments. And it was refreshing becoming Catholic when it was like, okay, I could accept it or not, but either way, God exists and like Christianity is true. So it's like my Christianity is not riding on whether or not evolution is true. However, I think it's a both and with these things. Like, let's have metaphysical arguments and wait, why are we just blindly accepting evolution right now when our science is like actually way more acute? Like, we should follow the evidence like he's doing to the best of our ability, and we shouldn't just assume evolution to be true because like our teachers taught it to us. And I'm sorry, like it's okay to, I like both, that it's okay to accept evolution. Like our faith isn't in jeopardy, which is why we don't focus too much on it.
Right.
But also, like, why are we just blindly assuming it's true? Because it is a huge excuse for atheism. Like a lot of atheists just are like, I believe in evolution, so I don't believe in God. And you can either go one of two ways. You can be like, well, actually, that's not an objection to God. Or you can say, well, what do you think about the irreducible complexity of bacterial flagellum, and make them a little bit doubtful of their presuppositions. Maybe you haven't looked at all the science behind evolution either.
Sure,
Right,
but I learned the new response though. It's just they just say spandrel. Apparently, that's the new.
Well, there's more fundamental differences. I mean, fundamental difficulties to the naturalistic theory of evolution. But Plantinga makes a good point, right? He's like, look, you have to realize, like, for the skeptic and the atheist, evolution is the only game in town. It has to be true, right? If we don't have that, we've got nothing. Whereas Catholics can say, hey, look, if evolution is true, properly understood, it points in favor of theism. If it happens that evolution in any sense isn't true, it points in favor of theism. So it just, like, we can and should follow all the evidence where it leads. There's no reason to sweat over this issue. Be totally open to it. But yeah, as coming from a kind of a skeptical background, like, this better work, it has to work. But there's even more fundamental difficulties, right? And it has to do with a naturalistic worldview to begin with. Like, if you're just starting with physical simples that are dumb, unconscious, undirected, unintelligent, you're never going to evolve something that is conscious, unified, directed, intelligent from that. That is a qualitative categorical abyss that you will never be able to cross. And of course, that's kind of more of a deeper philosophical commitment, but that's inherently kind of built into most atheistic worldviews. So the hard problem of consciousness, I'm saying, you can't resolve that through evolution. That's entirely independent.
Because we've talked a lot about the ID and evolution idea, which is big. Honestly, I read a poll about people who left the faith, and one of the main anecdotal pieces of evidence was learning about evolution when I went to college. Like, that was the quote or the reason that they gave. So at least as Catholics, we can arm our students and our CCD classes to know that, no, hey, you don't have to give up your faith just by learning about this theory. So that's important. But I want to get to just two other things, because we've talked about a lot of different arguments. I want to offer what I think is maybe some different levels and categories, and then just ask one more question about what's not effective, because we talked about, like, some effective things. Pat listed 7 or 8 things. Eric, you gave us 2 things as well. My personal framework, with Pat, I kind of put the metaphysical demonstrations at the top. Those are like the hardcore natural theology. They're going to get you the most robust conceptions of God if you can roll up your sleeves and do the metaphysics. Personally, what I like, and I'm trying to finish up a book where I do a little popular level discussion of these, I like Robert Delfino's take on the third way of St. Thomas Aquinas. So, Pat, I'll refer listeners to an episode he did on your show. We could link, he was on my show as well. He has a nice way of walking through Aquinas' third way, which is a sort of contingency argument. It starts by imagining that there's just a world with one possible being that's incoherent, 2 possible beings, and then adding more possible beings turns out to be incoherent. So you have to have at least one necessary being, and then you could deduce various attributes of there to show that the absolutely necessary being is God. I think some form of metaphysical contingency argument everyone should learn, at least in some sense. And we have options. We have Delfino's take on the third way. You have Fazer, he discusses the rationalist proof in chapter 5 of his book. You have Josh Rasmussen, Dr. Rasmussen's How Reason Can Lead to God. He's got a whole development he incorporates a ton of great new research and develops his own contingency sort of argument. So I think I kind of put that at the top level of rigor, but also gets us like the clearest and most robust conclusions. Below that, best explanation of things. What best explains various phenomena? That's where you go with what Pat listed. What best explains the beginning of the universe, the fine tuning, the appearance of consciousness, the resurrection. He had a whole list there. And then, like, below that, I would say other signposts, clues, or things that make it more probable that theism is true versus atheism is true. And perhaps that's where we relegate those confirmatory evidences from intelligent design. Maybe they go there. But also, at some point, we're going to have to make a transition. How do we bring Jesus into the discussion? If this is part of a, evangelization effort and not simply, an academic discipline, which you can do that. You could have natural theology. Dr. Gavin Kerr is teaching philosophy classes, and they're just doing rigorous philosophical arguments. Boom, 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 boom. But if we want to incorporate it into our evangelization, I wanted to ask you guys, how do you make the transition, or how would you bring like Jesus into this and Christianity and perhaps the Catholic Church after you give some evidence. So someone's like, show me the evidence. Okay, here's my evidence. Maybe they're like, okay, I can kind of see that, but how do you incorporate Jesus and the Catholic Church into all of that? And I know we don't have a ton of time, so maybe just a few minutes on that.
Well, I'm not on a time limit here unless you guys are. I'm having all kinds of fun. Eric, did you wanna take a swing at this one first? Or?
Sure. I just have a thought that I just want to put out there. That's just something I think about, which is kind of it's just an interesting thought. Okay, so like in our Catholic belief, we believe that God not only exists, but that He became man in the person of Jesus Christ. So God revealed Himself fully in the person of Jesus Christ. He came 2,000 years ago, so He actually walked on the earth. He was born in Bethlehem. He grew up in Nazareth. So it's like, what's crazy to me in light of our belief already, so in light of our faith, it is kind of crazy that God became man and dwelt among us, and we still doubt His existence. Like, how is that possible? Like, what? And so it's just a thing that I think about. Like, why is that the case? And so anyway, that's just a side tangent. Maybe y'all can chime in on that. But once you get to God's existence, it's like, okay, well, like, wouldn't it make sense that like He would have created us like for like a purpose, and like maybe He would love us and is good, and so maybe this God wouldn't just want to hide Himself, but maybe He'd want to reveal Himself, and then you know Jesus and the Bible in general is a series of stories of how God reveals Himself first to the people of Israel, right, and walks with them and establishes a covenant of love with them, and then we see the fullness of that in the new covenant in Jesus Christ. And there's good evidence. Obviously, even atheist skeptics believe that Jesus historically existed and that He was crucified. And there's also good evidence that He rose from the dead, like secular historian like Josephus, who's Jewish and not even Christian, talks about the empty tomb, right? And so you have this evidence of this resurrection. And so coming back to Jesus, though, I also think about going back to the transcendentals, like how does this resonate with the human heart? Like when you watch a movie, for instance, and you're moved, like there's some reason why you're crying when someone sacrifices themselves. There's a reason why you're moved by that. And like, so if God is good and He's actually all loving, wouldn't it make sense that if He did become man, He would actually sacrifice Himself for us? Mm-hmm. Like if God is love and the fullness of love is this total gift of self, then wouldn't it make sense that like if He became man, that He would offer His whole self to us? And guess what? We now get to participate in that communion of love with God in the Catholic Church through the Eucharist. And so it naturally leads one to the other: God's existence, God's covenant of love, Jesus Christ, the fullest expression, and His manifestation of the God who is love, and our participation through the Church.
Right. Yeah, that's beautifully said, Eric. And I just echo a few of those points. Is if we already have prior independent reason to believe in God, and not just any like type of God, but we have a robust classical theism that God really is perfectly good, perfectly loving. It has this sort of package of omni qualities, if you will: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, right? Then what's the probability that the incarnation will occur? And the answer there is, I have no idea, right? None. But given that, can I make sense of something like the incarnation? Is this something that fits with that worldview? And does the transformation that the world has gone through since this, we would argue, miraculous historical event, does that, like, we might have some degree of expectation that something like that might occur, that God might want to form a relationship with us in some way, that He might care about us in some way, that He might even sacrifice for us in some way to make His love all the more manifest. And it seems to me overwhelmingly obvious that yes, that actually makes really good sense. It fits like a hand in a glove. And I think that that's helpful because when you have those prior philosophical arguments, it just boosts the case, right? It's just more evidence all pointing in the same direction rather than evidence pointing in different directions. So it has a sort of cumulative force or cumulative probability to it. And it also makes it so you don't need as much evidence on the ground, right? If you already have prior reason to believe that somebody's a criminal and that you had prior reason to expect that they were going to rob a store at this, that, and time, and then a crime actually happens, well, if you had prior reason to already expect this, then the amount of evidence you need on the scene will naturally have to doesn't have to be as high if you had no prior reason to expect it, right? Well, same thing. If we have prior reason to believe in a God of love, then we don't need as much evidence on the ground, say, to support the resurrection. But the amazing thing is we have a tremendous amount of evidence on the ground to support the resurrection, as Eric already hinted at. And I think that too just increases the reasonableness and responsibility of Christian belief. So I guess in a way that the kind of philosophical background, the worldview, not only bolsters the case, but it fits with the case, and it all kind of converges. And that was Newman's point, right? Is that we often come to assent not through one argument or not through one piece of evidence, not through one experience, but through converging and convincing pieces of evidences, different arguments, different experiences, different intuitions, different hunches, different testimonies, different witnesses. And I think when you take that kind of synoptic vision, yeah, I'm with you. At this point in my life, it just seems very clear to me that this is true. And then we might have further degree of expectation. Okay, that if Christ founded a church, and if that church is, as Catholics believe, to endure to the end of the world, does it make sense that the Catholic Church 2,000 years later, despite all attempts of the world to destroy it, is still here? Does that make sense given the fundamental Catholic belief? It seems like yes. It seems like great empirical support of Christ's promise that the church will last to the end of the world against the gates of hell, right? So I think there's a lot of ways that you can kind of work it from the philosophical case specifically into Catholicism without having to get too heavy-handed on the historical details, but just looking, again, synoptically, looking at it as a whole, which I think can be very helpful for people.
No, I think it's important stuff. When we make that transition, I think both of you are, Eric and Pat, what you're both kind of getting at is what the church refers to as motives of credibility.
Yeah.
For faith and for divine revelation. And we kind of touched on all those different motives of credibility, and they might affect different people in different ways, as Pat was just getting at. But you have different miracles that you can point to. Traditionally, the church has pointed to prophecies, and then as well as the church herself, kind of that endurance over time. Those all form motives of credibility to at least get someone looking. And if they already think there's a decent amount of evidence for God, that should motivate them to look. I like pressing someone at least to the point, you got to deal with some way. What do you think about Jesus's radical claims about himself?
Yeah.
What do you think about the stuff that he actually said? And you kind of have to deal with some form of Lewis's trilemma, or if you want to make it a quadrilemma, an argument that, okay, but most people aren't ready to do that right away. They're like, well, I don't know. I just thought he was a good moral teacher. And then, some Christians, but that's not really open to you if he's also claiming to be God, or if he's claiming to have a high level of divinity. Maybe you're even not super convinced that he's fully God. I think you make a good case for that from Scripture, but just the fact you can look at a bunch of his radical claims. Maybe we should list some in a moment. Eric, I can kick it over to you because I know you know the Scriptures. But the idea is you got to do something with that. Was he lying? Was that part of his good moral teaching to just tell some lies about himself? Or was he some kind of maniac that had a, just Messiah divinity complex? And he
Spandrel.
God, yeah. You gotta list Spandrel. If there's one thing I've heard in this conversation, are you going to explain it by a spandrel? I mean, how else are you going to make this argument here? And they have to decide somewhere. And one of the options has to be, well, he actually is who he claimed to be. And, the evidence for the resurrection can kind of confirm that and play on that. But I like pointing to Jesus's radical claims. Do you have scriptures offhand that you like to go to for that, Eric?
Well, I mean, why did the Jews want to crucify him? First of all, it's because they claimed that he blasphemed, claiming to be God. So he claimed they understood he claimed to be God. And they not only, because of that, they could have stoned him, but they told Pilate, like, hey, our law doesn't permit us to crucify. It doesn't permit us to put anyone to death. They want him to be crucified because if he was crucified, hung on a tree, that would show that he's cursed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that's why they wanted that. And so he was like, he's claiming to be the Son of God, making himself equal to God. One of the scenes in the scriptures from John, which John is the most obvious in all these things, but Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Using the divine name that was revealed to Moses at the burning bush, like, I am who I am. And so Jesus is claiming that on himself. And that's why they do actually get stones picked up to stone him, but he escapes. So they understand he's claiming to be God. And then also we have different scenes, like actually, I learned this when I went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, that in the Jewish way of thinking about things, they use stories. So like when Jesus walks on water, it's a clear demonstration of his divinity because only God can do something like that. And in fact, in that scene, I just learned this past fall that when the disciples are freaking out in the boat and Jesus is walking on the water, he says, "Be not afraid, I am."
Right.
Most of our translations, it says, "It is I," but the Greek is ego eimi, which is the exact same phrase that is used in the Septuagint when the burning bush scene is like, "I am. I am who I am." So he's saying, "I am. Be not afraid, I am." And so we have all of this evidence that Jesus Christ is claiming to be God. And also in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." So as the new Moses, he's not just saying, "I'm a new prophet." He's saying, "I am the lawgiver," which is a claim to divinity, which is why the people react like, who can speak with such authority? So there's
I think of course, the big one that Lewis always loves to point out, since we're talking about Lewis, is who can forgive sins but God alone? Who is this man that is forgiving sins, right?
Right.
Which a lot of us we kind of overlook that, but that would have been, and still is, hugely significant, right?
No, I think that's big. And similar to how we're prepared to grant evolution and still give a design argument, I think these days when we're given the evidence for Jesus and his divinity, we almost have to be prepared to maybe grant that John has a high Christology, because that's kind of the new thing. Is like, all right, John was writing in the 90s. He was old. He was in a community where he was just making stuff up about divinity, but none of the other gospels said that Jesus was divine. So I think we need to prepare to tackle that, which is good, Eric, because you pointed to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. Pat's talking about forgiveness of sins. That's even in Mark. Other one I like, and Dr. Brant Petrie is like the go-to guy on all this stuff. But in Mark 15, at Jesus's trial, he applies like a passage from Daniel 7. He applies it to himself about the Ancient of Days coming on the clouds that they will worship. And, you know, he said, like, he applies that verse to himself, saying that he will be worshipped, that he is that Ancient of Days, claim to divinity there. And the fact that that's even in the earliest stuff, the Synoptic Gospels, will go a long way towards, you still got to deal with these claims. Jesus said this stuff. I mean, this is written very early and close to the events. What are you going to do with it?
So most,
No, go ahead, Eric.
Most people do think that Mark was written first, right? And so that's why I love the Jesus walking on water argument, and like the ego eimi. That's in Mark. That's not in John. I mean, he does do that in John as well.
Let's get that on the table. So Mark 2 is the forgiveness of sins, what Pat said. I don't know where walking on the water is, but it's in Mark. It might be 6 or something. I can't remember. And then Mark 15 is the trial. So those are 3 strong examples you could give in the earliest gospel.
Right. And there are arguments that Matthew was written first. I'm pretty sure that's Tim DeGrew's position. And again, I would just say the Catholics don't make unnecessary concessions, right? There is great evidence for the reliability and trustworthiness of John as a reportage model. He was, after all, an eyewitness. So like we have to keep these things in mind, right? Like, don't make unnecessary concessions, right? And I think if people were willing to, again, roll up their sleeves and do the historical work and read people like Brant Petrie or the McGrews who've done serious scholarship on the reliability of the Gospels, they will be, I think, very surprised, right? And but the other point that I want to make, because you brought up the quad lemma, well, maybe this is all myth. That's not going to work, because the earliest and best evidence we have for the life of Christ is inexplicably bound up with all of these claims, right? So you can't just say that this was some guy who just went to India once and came back with all these yogic beliefs, because Christ was a Jew. He was Jewish, right? They called him rabbi, right? So you can't just piecemeal what you want him to be. You have to take it on the evidence that we actually have for him. And all of that, of course, is just the best evidence we have. And Eric mentioned Josephus, but again, as Christians, don't make unnecessary concessions. The best and earliest evidence we have is Christian by default, because the people who were close to that evidence became Christian, right? Duh, right? Like, imagine, like, and people don't think about that, right? Like, well, could we have something outside of the Bible? Well, why is this stuff in the Bible? Because the church, through its tradition, understood what the best and earliest sources and most reliable sources were and put them together. So it just by default that the best evidence for all this is found in the Bible. And this is something that, of course, completely secular historians agree with. This is not just a religious claim. And I think it's really important for people to keep that in mind.
That is
It's
refreshing,
really
Pat.
important.
That is refreshing.
Yeah, and I was going to say the Apostle Paul's testimony, like his radical
Yeah.
conversion, that's something that Habermas and Lacona and all them and Craig have done, like, a ton of research on, and that's really taken seriously even by secular historians, that there was this guy Paul who was a Jew, who writes like a Jew, who wrote these letters, and he literally converted. That's got to be something that we need to explain.
Who was a homicidal maniac. And right, like he was, and had this profound conversion experience, right? I was joking with Tim on the podcast that we do. It's like, how wonderful that would be if that was like the case for every homicidal maniac, like Stalin and Hitler, right? We wish that could be the case. So like, how do you explain that? How does that happen, right?
It's good stuff. Oh my gosh. Well, this is, I was just going to say, if there's one thing I learned, well, that could just be the objection to anything, the Gospel of John. Well, maybe it was a spandrel. As we try to draw this to a close here, we've covered tons of good stuff. I wanted to give us a chance to say maybe one thing we thought that was ineffective or unhelpful in conversations, perhaps. It could be about God. It could be about Jesus, because we've talked a lot about the evidence, natural theology. We've talked about how do you bring it around to Christ and the Catholic Church. But maybe we'll just end with this. Like, what's one thing, as we think back to our own conversations, it could be an argument, an attitude, something that we found to be ineffective or unhelpful. And then, any other closing thought we want to add, because this has been so much fun. But Pat, I do apologize. I do have to run in like 5 or 10 minutes and get back to my distance learning in our mathematics here in New Jersey. But what's something along those lines of like ineffectiveness or unhelpfulness? And then we'll kind of close it out.
I'll say a general thing just very quickly, and I'll go back to what you said before, Eric, at least that I've seen for people who are Catholics. They have a good faith. It's inattentiveness. And this is where a lot of error comes from. It comes from being inattentive. And you gave the example of your catechism or Sunday school teacher saying that God made himself. Now, I think we can be charitable and realize that she's on to something, right? She's on to something that is directionally correct in some way. And that she recognizes that, okay, there seems to have to be an exception here. Like, not everything can have a cause. Because if everything were contingent, then everything would be depending on something beyond itself to exist. But there's nothing beyond everything, right? So that's impossible. There has to be at least something, even just one thing that is uncaused. Now, of course, she wasn't able to articulate that very well, but she was intuiting that there has to be something different about God, but she made the mistake by being inattentive by saying that God caused himself. Well, that still makes him a caused reality, and it's doubly absurd because now he would have to exist before himself in order to cause himself, and it's a whole mess, right? God is that which exists necessarily, whose essence is existence. So I would say, be attentive, be careful about what you say. And this should just apply for life in general. Just be careful about what you say. It's also okay to say, you know what, that's a really good question. I am not sure. Let me look into it. Let me research this. And would you mind if we just continue this conversation later? And don't feel that you always have to have all the answers. And it's a million times better to just say, I'm not sure. Let me look into it, than to bluff. Never bluff, never lie, and do not be inattentive, because if you say something that seems silly, even if you kind of got something that might possibly be right, you might turn somebody completely off from that. So that's what I'll end with.
Very good. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing that atheists just don't like to hear, and I don't like to hear it either, is just, hey, I just have faith. That's all I just believe. And so I think what's refreshing about being Catholic is that faith and reason go hand in hand. And so I think just having that balance of like, hey, reason leads to faith. We do need faith, but we don't just we don't have blind faith though. And so to just share with people that there are good reasons for God's existence and for the truth of Jesus Christ and all of that, I would just say refrain from just saying, I have faith. Instead, maybe you should just say, well, I don't know the answer to that, like Pat was saying. I don't know. Let me look into that. Let me look at the reasons. And there's plenty of resources to go to that. And so I think also the most ineffective things is like when we get heated in arguments or something, we just dig ourselves in a hole and we just, clinch to our little arguments because we're insecure. Ultimately, like we're insecure that we're going to be wrong or that we're going to be shown to be foolish. And it's like, hey, just be charitable. Like, remember that you're a Christian if you're a Christian, and that the God who you're arguing his existence for is the God who is love. And so if you're not displaying that love and speaking the truth in love, then you may be doing a greater harm than good.
Amen. People might not always remember the arguments you gave, but they will remember how you treated them as you were giving the arguments. And that's very important to keep in mind. Mm-hmm.
I think just to piggyback, I agree with both of you wholeheartedly in that. And I was just going to say for mine is if you come across the attitude where you're not taking the objections seriously, then that's going to be very ineffective or unhelpful down the road. I recently had a philosopher on my show, Dr. Tomas Bogardus, who is a great Catholic-minded philosopher. And he shares a lot of stories of his fellow philosopher colleagues who are atheists. And he says, or not just colleagues at his school, but just people he's talked to over the years. And a lot of them have the same story that, when they were teenagers, they came up with all these hard questions. Nobody gave them answers or even, took them seriously necessarily. Like they went to their parents, their priests, wherever they went to find an answer, nobody took them seriously. And then, so they just kind of fell away. So I think to have that attitude, like, you know what, you're raising a good question here, and treat that person as someone who wants to know truth, as Eric is saying, and we want to love them and help them to reach that truth. And hopefully we can, if we're attentive and we study, we can give some answers, but don't come across like, oh, that objection stinks, that, you're not even taking this seriously. Instead, just leave that attitude aside. Give them a specific answer if you have it. And if not, say, hey, that's a good question. Maybe we could work through this together. One more thought I wanted to add, because not an ineffective thing, but it hasn't come up at all in the conversation. But I know Pat and I have talked about this a lot recently. It's like that background of Pascal's wager, that you don't need to get everybody to 100% certainty that God exists and that he founded the Catholic Church in order to make a difference in their lives. I mean, if you press a skeptic, I almost don't think they're going to grant they have 100% logical certainty, maybe about anything. Or if it is, it's maybe just that they exist or that something exists, but nothing beyond that. So that's not really the level where we want to aim at. Dr. Rhoda has done such great work in showing that if you can get someone even to think that it's plausible, maybe you get Christianity onto that 50% credence level where someone's like, okay, there's good reasons to believe in God. There's these plausible motives of credibility. You don't have to get them to force themselves to believe, which is a caricature of Pascal's wager, but just get them to make some sort of commitment. Maybe it's a commitment to pray for a couple of weeks. I'm going to pray for 5 minutes, and they can be conditional. Like, God, if you exist, help me understand you. Maybe it's a commitment to attend some sort of service or event. But the idea that, we have to convince them 100% of the way is absolute not what we're trying to do. And that's not how evangelism works. We're going to propose good ideas to folks. Hopefully with the Holy Spirit's help, they're going to be able to bring themselves to make a commitment. And then over time, like we hope to grow, then our faith will go stronger, our confidence will go stronger, and we'll come to see real in our lives. But come with this, and maybe Pascal's wager, we could talk about all that. And Eric, your friend on animal suffering, maybe that's something we can deal in another.
But hey, we need to do a part 2. How about that?
So sounds great. Pat, do you want to close us out here? Because this is technically your show.
Oh, is it? Yeah, I'll just say, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. We've only scratched the surface here. So, of course, I would love to do a second part. So let's make that happen. And thank you both for being here.
Thanks,
It's been
Pat.
a ton of fun. Take care.